Happy weekend to you, NIO FAM. This one's for you. We're going to talk about the 6-month time frame back in 2020 where the stock price ran from, in fact, at the low, the date that I'm starting with was May 26, 2020. The low was $3.40. And it was on November 23rd of 2020. The high of that day was $55.70. The close was $55.38. But on screen right now, I want to show and do a comparison of the most recent roughly 31 trade days since we've got this recent uptrend going on. Now, the last trade day of date so that you can have a timestamp or date and timestamp for this recording is August 22nd. That's over here on the right-hand side. A couple of things that are going to be recurring themes. And I've got it'll make a lot more sense why I've kept them at the bottom of the screen once I get through this, because the trade volume, for example, is an indicator of short-term stock price action for NIO stock, particularly when we see big volume. For example, this day, which was August 22nd, a Friday, we had over 200 million shares trade, and you see the move that was made with the stock. All right, but here's where it gets really interesting is now I'm going to show you the roughly 31 days where the 2020 stock price run started. Check this out. This is the left-hand side showing the right hand is the recent stock price, so just disregard that. Left-hand side, I've got it queued up for the roughly 31 comparable days. So now I'm going to go back so you can see where we are now. And again, the point that I want to make is the 234 million share trade volume right here. That was an indicator of that big move up. Now, if we go back to 2020, look at where the trade volume started spiking here. Over 224 million shares traded, followed by over 330 million shares, followed by 446 million shares, followed by almost 600 million shares. And that's where we had the stock price back at that time go from a little under $8 to break into the teens. And then it would go to about, I think, around $15 here at this point, just within those, roughly the same time frame. But again, the big difference is bigger volume, and it came in right here at this time frame back then, and we haven't seen that. We may be seeing the beginning of it. I don't know. I'm not counting on it. I'm just, again, sharing the data as I think it's pretty compelling and interesting to kind of look back and then also look at where we are now. Now, this was the, if you look over here, the 6-month move back in 2020. And again, I want you to kind of focus on the trade volume, which is represented here in the gray, the bars, and you'll see how much the stock was able to really gain momentum and move up aggressively when those bigger days were in play. This was the November 23rd date where it was that $55.70 high. Not the highest it's ever been, by the way, but just within the 6-month move, that's kind of where it started from, was back here around the $3.40 range, and that was the move. But notice how that volume was so important along the way, and it gets even more compelling when we toss in or mix in the FTD data. So now we're looking at the FTD data only for that roughly 6-month time frame back in 2020. And there are a few notes that I have, so I'm going to kind of read these off as I notice them. The first thing is, if you'll notice, when the stock, and there is consolidation going on here with the stock price action in the teens and into the 20s, but what happened is the last spike FTD wise of 1 million came at the end of August back then. So from May, and this would have been the beginning, this was May 26 right here, what you saw with the stock price down in the $3.50 range basically is, it looks to me like the shorts were not scared of anything for a while. They just kept coming in with these FTDs. And the problem is, we as retail can never see these real time. We only get this data about 30 days after the fact. So it's always lagged data. And if you're wondering what things look like right now, I'll pull up the full failure to deliver chart for NIO stock. This is where we are. Look at how heavy this has been over the last, and this is just 2024 and 2025. We're talking about millions and millions of these FTDs coming in. All right. Now, the time frame we're talking about and comparing it to is back here So you're looking at about from here back to this point. But look at what happens. For a few months, they just weren't even scared. And then once it started getting away from them, and I think that coincided with the big volume upticks, like those hundreds and hundreds of millions of shares being traded, I think at that point, shorts decided, or they got torched, or they just decided they needed to get out of the way. So now if we come back and break this down just a little bit further, again, I have a few more notes, because even the importance of the 100 million trade volume on a single trade day seems to make a difference. So within the first time frame here, over from roughly the late May 2020 time frame, you had, let's see if I can get my notes straight here, there were only 9 days with 100 million shares traded through July 1st. So it was kind of slow, and that's actually somewhat consistent with what we've seen here in the last roughly 30 trade days, is about that same number of days with over 100 million shares. And we haven't seen them jump as high as fast as they did back then. So that 200 million number here that's on screen most recently, that's a big number. We haven't seen that kind of number in a while. So that makes this next week perhaps even more compelling and interesting to track, especially the daily trade volume, to see what's going to happen. But then after that, there were, from July 2nd through the 22nd, there were 14 straight trade days with 100 million shares traded of NIO stock. And what we saw was the stock price go from about $9 to the $15 range. And then after that, eventually they started slowing down because at that point we are right here in the July 22nd time frame. And so then after that, sorry, I'm trying to make sense of my notes, but I had so much data to pull up and share. It was going to be a little tricky. I'll just go from what I can see on screen. If you'll note, this is the 1 million level for those FTDs coming in. And then we come back to this, July 22nd, 2020 date. Then your price range is still in the low teens, but it's consolidating. And we aren't going to see any more of these big spikes. In fact, we didn't even see this is the last 1 million spike that we saw on the FTD side of things until October of 2021. And I do have a couple things to point out with that, but I want to get back to the full screen with the FTD history to point that out and show you the price action on the chart and share some of my thinking with that as well. So basically, the way I'm looking at this and seeing this is the shorts weren't scared. They weren't scared. And then probably right in here where the price starts popping up and you had that big volume. This is a 334 million share trade volume day. This is a 446 million. Remember, I showed those before, and this is the one almost 600 million. So at this point, you've got the stock price moving up pretty aggressively with that big volume. And I think basically, and part of this with the FTDs is because they can push these out. We never get a true time frame, even after the fact that it's already lagged data. These could be pushed out for a month or more. And so we don't know necessarily when they stopped. It could have been earlier than when they were actually reported, if that makes sense. But what is obvious is the right side of this. You can see the shorts got out of the way, or they got torched. One of the two things happened, maybe both things happened. So now, because I do have the three key indicators at the bottom of the screen for the short-term stock price action and what I've been tracking, and now you have a better sense of why I've said the trade volume is the simplest, easiest thing to track, and 100 million shares or more seems to matter for NIO stock. But if you look at the one time where NIO stock really took off, it's also the only time the FTDs truly dropped off. And so those two things aligning with the big trade volume and the FTDs dropping off, and what I think is equally compelling as to what we saw back here is just like the FTDs dropped off and then the price really shot up aggressively. This is a lot of FTD data coming in here, and it has been heavy for a few years. So do we see, and even if we go back to here, I think this is a $15 price range for NIO stock. And even look at look at how this is an over 2 million spike that came in. And then over here, you've got 5 million, you've got 6 million, you've got, I mean, shorts have just been all over this thing. And to put it in the terms that Tom Hayes just said in his podcast, I think the example he gave is, imagine pushing a beach ball under the water, and then when it explodes up. I don't know if that's what we're going to see. But again, since we perhaps have seen it happen once before, and we have some of this very compelling data and things kind of aligning really nicely, I did want to talk about it and go a little more in depth on it. Here's the other one, the sentiment gauge. And if we look at most of the history of NIO Stock with the Reddit mentions, and this is just a simple gauge for it, there's another one that I want to toss in there as well, and that's the analysts. I remember watching the analysts follow and change all of their price targets up, and they were all trailing NIO Stock after the stock really started shooting and took off to the upside. So they're all very, very low with their numbers right now. So that's another thing that I'll kind of take as a gauge of sentiment, when after they are all behind the stock price and the stock prices further advanced way ahead of where they are. I think that's when we'll have more of a maybe industry view on sentiment shifting for NIO Stock. As far as the retail side, the NIO Reddit mentions, again, this is most of the history. It only goes back to February of 2020, but this is kind of that time frame where we saw the big move up to about here. And Wall Street Bets had, let's see, this is 1,000 mentions. This is the 500 level down here. So a lot of that time frame, it wasn't every day, but there were some days where there were hundreds or even thousands of mentions. But interestingly enough, where we are recently is 4 here recently. I think there was one with about 20. So sentiment, even on the retail side of things, is very quiet. And then I did hone in a little bit on the that 6-month window, so you could see how that picked up. And maybe it had an impact on stock price. I think, if anything, the thing that stood out to me the most was when the really big volume days were coming in. Like this is a 349 million share trade volume day right here. And you see a lot of mentions, over 2,000, 2,600 actually. And then the biggest volume day, perhaps, maybe in the history of NIO Stock, I'm not sure on that. But this is a 582 million share volume day and 3,400 mentions on NIO. So for Wall Street Bets for NIO. Anyway, I thought this actually turned out to be a lot more interesting, compelling video from a data and kind of analytical standpoint than I thought it was going to be. I wasn't sure how interesting it would be, but I'll stick with what I've been saying for a while. The trade volume seems to matter. 100 million share trade volume seems to be a positive for NIO Stock. It seems to make things a little trepidatious, perhaps, for the shorts. And if we start seeing more days like this, 200 and above on the 200 million shares traded and above, I think shorts better watch out. And the alignment of this on the fundamental side with NIO Stock, or with NIO as a company, positioning for a Q4 break even the earnings in the near term. We've got September 2nd earnings, and they've positioned that nicely. It's probably going to come a day after we're going to get a new monthly delivery record. And NIO is still in the first, this is my big picture thinking, they're still in the first major growth phase for me, which is market awareness, brand awareness. Even within China, they're still not known all over China yet. So this company has a long way it can still go on the fundamental side of things. And that's frankly what I'm most interested in, but it is kind of fun to nerd out on some of this data. Here's the other thing that I mentioned earlier. I want to break it down and show, let's see, let me hone in here. It was March of 2021, and that is right in here. Yep, because I looked earlier and I was like, wow, that's kind of the first time after NIO made its really huge move and stayed up for a while, and it was before the FTDs had picked back up yet. It was the first time that it dipped down under $40. And I remember doing a video around that time frame. It was in 2021. I can't remember what month exactly, but I remember seeing Citadel, and I called him the suspicious short that was involved in NIO, and it was just something to keep an eye on. But there was another thing that had gone on at that time, and it was in March. It was early March, I believe. I've pulled it up in previous videos, and I'll maybe pull some stuff and link it in the description so you can check it out and dig a little further if you wish as well. But it's ETPs. Some of these, there are countries in Europe where it is allowed to naked short. And there are also these leveraged ETPs that are, I guess, trading the stock, even though they don't trade the stock there. NIO is only listed in Singapore and China and Hong Kong and the US. So with that, I thought it was interesting that the same time frame that those were being created, and it was probably at least potentially an avenue that some, maybe bad actors or suspicious shorts could perhaps do things across all or more time frames, that maybe it wasn't a shock that we started to see, the NIO stock price start coming back down, even though it did try and make another move up before eventually coming down. And then again, of course, the big moves down didn't come until we started seeing big FTD numbers come through as well. So I just nerded out kind of hardcore. So if you stuck around to the end, wow, I'm impressed. And thank you. And drop it in the comments. I want to hear from you what your thoughts are. I will create timestamps since this is a longer video, but I just, I'm very excited for, and I don't have it queued up, but I'll share this concept since I'm already in a long video. The concept that I had with choosing NIO as a long-term play was it's an IDE, an innovative driven enterprise. And I think historically what we've seen, even on the shorting side of things with the FTDs, and I've showed some of that historical data for companies like Tesla, Apple, NVDA, Netflix, Amazon. These companies had to go through a lot of investment, a lot of R&D before they could become truly profitable and really have the global impact that they have now become global giants basically. And NIO, I thought, had that potential. But as the years have gone on and I've gotten more time and research into it, I found things like looking back at Tesla with its probably, one of, if not the biggest short squeezes maybe we've ever seen. And it came on the heels of a lot of FTDs. And I believe it was the full year profitability and the inclusion in the S&P 500, which created a lot more buying pressure. And that, I think, is why it moved so much. So the reality is, and why NIO becomes even more compelling, is it has moved higher faster and at an earlier point without being profitable. And so I don't necessarily expect it to move like Tesla did. I certainly don't need it to move like that to be very happy with where this thing can go. But it is kind of interesting to kind of track some of these things and then look back at some of the other companies. And I just wonder what potential, this stock can have, with or without a short squeeze. So anyway, I'm done. I've talked a lot more than I needed to. So hopefully something that I said was interesting or compelling. Again, I will create the timestamps. I will have links and share some things in the description. Have a great day or night whenever you see this. And this next week could be kind of a fun one to track things for NIO stock. We'll see what that trade volume looks like come Monday. So anyway, I'll see you all again very soon.